We talk about changing the narrative, but one thing that I found out is that you cannot change a narrative in its middle. You have to start with the beginning. It's hard to change the end of a story if you haven't started in the beginning. Even when we write our thesis, come on scholars, when we write our thesis papers, your conclusion should match your introduction. Good. So we have to contribute to this narrative. That's the only way that we are going to promote change in the narrative, is because we have to contribute to it. What is happening is the reason, and this is just me. The way that I see it is that God's truth is a continual narrative. He says, my word will not return void, right? It will go out to do everything that I accomplished to do it to do. It says that his word is everlasting to everlasting. It will always be there. His word is truth, and you cannot add nothing to it. You can't take nothing away. So the thing about it is, since we are in this narrative, what has happened, what has changed is not the narrative, it's us. We have not been doing what we are supposed to do, which is to contribute to the narrative of God in our praise and in our worship and in our thanksgiving and in our gathering together. We have not been contributing. We've been oppressing each other and pulling down each other and not doing all of the things that we are supposed to do. We have to be careful, people of God, in the black church, because this is the only thing that really belongs to us. So the Barmen Confession on the Identity of the Church determines that anyone who believes that the state over and beyond its special commission should become the sole and supreme authority in human life has been taught falsely. By allowing the state, that's the world, to become the supreme authority would be allowing it to fulfill the vocation of the church as though it were an institution. The church's sole existence is that it serves as a regime of mediation. And the church is separated from secular institution because of certain traditional practices unique to the methods of worship and its therapeutic response to trauma. These include faith in the gospel message, communal response, and sacramental traditions of the congregation. It's this kind of fellowship that creates a community of believers that should be viewed in a narrow sense, such as local congregations, or in a wide sense, such as the universal church as a larger organism. As we are transitioning this conversation to the womanist response, it is important to note here that the leadership within the churches have the power to make unique contributions to the narrative of healing and process of those who are suffering the aftermath of domestic violence, of childhood abuse, or of control in general. The kind of suffering that the church responds to in and of itself may not appear to be redemptive, but it does provide the opportunity to assist in the transformation of its parishioners. Black women in particular have a unique struggle. We are builders, but in certain segments, the old regime refuses to recognize women as a part of the foundation. Some of the story that makes us powerful as powerful as we are is the gruesome portion of our history that men have laid hands on us. And as for many of us, it has not been the right or proper touch. Women clergy in the black church have more often than not shared that portion of the narrative, that we have not received the gentle touch of Christ through the men that were designated to protect us. And many men share this narrative too. The challenge for clergy women in the black church is that we have extended our hands to offer the gentle touch of Christ, but we are often shunned by the narrative that says we have no right to extend our hands. In this poem, the laying on of hands, it best articulated the narrative that I want to add to change the narrative. I can't say her name, but it's Tekotse Shange, I think it is. That's how you say it. She says, I was missing something. Something so important, something promised. A laying on of hands. Fingers near my forehead, cool, strong, moving, making me whole. Sense pure, all the God coming into me, laying me open to myself. I was missing something promised, something free, a laying on of hands. She goes on in this narrative to say that something that was happening, there was a narrative that she was sharing of women who had been abused and had been psychologically mistreated, and they were still trying to make strides within their community. A laying on of hands. That's one of the things that our church needs now more than ever. In her conclusion, she says, I was cold, I was burning up, a child and endlessly weaving garments for the moon with my tears, but I found God in myself. And I loved her. I loved her fiercely. A laying on of hands. Since the church or the Christian community is often located within a secularized community, it easily becomes a place for people who are dealing with oppressive forces of the world to find refuge. It becomes a place to find living water, comfort, and a spiritual quenching truth. It is in the traditions of worship that people are unified in spirit, thus making a church a place for unified worship. It's liberating from the bonds of mental and societal oppression. Therefore, a theological approach that is fitting for this church environment is a therapeutic wellness, which is the laying on of hands found in womanist theology. This brings me to the perspective of this thesis, which is concerning the responsiveness of the church and to the identity confusion in regard to the result of spiritual and psychological trauma due to the cultured indoctrination of sin, which oppresses female clergy in the Black church. I listed, and I'm concluding now, some women throughout the Bible who have overcome the tension. Some women in the Bible who have been responsible for the restorative practices that are in the sanctuaries of our community, of our churches, of our culture. See, there's something about a woman's touch that can bring healing to a community. Deborah was a judge. I mentioned her. The one reason why women leaders come forward is because sometimes the men won't go. I mentioned Miriam, who wasn't selfish with her worship. She worshiped for everybody. You find that in women leaders. In 2 Kings 22, Josiah finds the long-lost book of the law. And it was interesting that Hadullah, the prophetess, had a leading role in the restoration of the people and their direction of worship to God. Esther, we all know who Esther is. She risked her own life to save her people. These are the things that women in leadership do. Mary Magdalene, as terrible as they tried to stone her for being herself, she was the first person Jesus sent with the message of hope. Mary of Bethany, who was one of the many women who followed Jesus, and she would sit at the feet of the teacher. And she was a student of the Lord. Although often confused with Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene was the first to see the risen Lord, so she was the first witness. Women in leadership. I love this one. Lydia. Uh-huh. She knew how to make that money. Oh yeah, we got women in the church. Come on, y'all, that know how to make that money. We got some business women in the church.
Yes, we do.
And then we have deacons, Phoebe, who held that title. We have Priscilla, along with her husband Aquila, who were great teachers. And the last one, the prophets. Because Joel, too, foretold a time when God would pour out his spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy on the day of Pentecost. And any daughter of God has the full rights and privilege to declare his word, testify to his salvation, and prophesy by his spirit. So will we comply with the narrative that is already written?
Amen.
Will we contribute to the narrative that is written to govern the Black church? That all of us have been tasked with an assignment. Lastly, Isaiah 58. Women and men, cry loud and spare not. Lift up your voice like a trumpet and tell my people their transgression, and yet the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask me the ordinance of justice. They take delight in approaching God. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? Why have we afflicted our souls, and you take no notice? Here's the reason why. In fact, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exploit all of your labors. Indeed, you fast for strife and debate, and to strike with the fist of wickedness, and I'll add control. You will not fast as you do in this day, to make your voice heard on high. Is it the fast that I have chosen, a day for man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head like a bulrush, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Would you call this a fast, an acceptable day of the Lord? Is this not the fast that I have chosen? Here we go. To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring your house into your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover them and do not hide yourself from your own flesh. When you do this, then your light shall break forth like the morning. Your healing shall spring forth speedily. And your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call on the Lord, and he will answer, and you shall cry, and he will say, here I am.
Here I am.
If you take away the yoke from your midst,
Amen.
the pointing a finger and speaking wickedness, if you extend your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light shall shine in the dawn, like dawn in the darkness, and your darkness shall be as the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul. This is my prayer, that the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought and strengthen your bones, and that you shall be like a watered garden and a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. Now here's your warning. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, resting, taking breaks, I'm still talking about us, from doing your pleasure, you know what you want to do, on my holy day. And if you begin to call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord.
Amen.
And he says, and I will cause you to rise on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. For the Lord, the word of the Lord has spoken. Amen.
You may be seated, Dr. Robinson, since you have a few minutes to entertain a few questions. If you have any questions, we'll have an opportunity to raise a question.
Dr. Robinson, I don't have a question, but I have a comment, and I'm going to try to make it brief. Your lecture, through your lecture, I feel affirmed and confirmed. I began my ministry at a time period when there was open hostility in the African American church to women in ministry. I've been in ministry now for 36 years. And you described almost every step of my journey. And I was just thinking to myself the other day, what is the framework in which I can describe what I've experienced through my journey in ministry? I was told when I got to seminary that they didn't want to accept me. I was the only black woman in my class. When my pastor, who at the time was also the state convention president for the Empire Missionary Baptist Convention, decided he was going to ordain me, it caused such a rift in the convention that it almost split.
Right.
I've ministered in contexts where my biggest fight was not against the devil, at least not traditionally as we think of it, but against the men and women, and most particularly the women in the black church. I've endured who does she think she is. I've endured this attitude where I was arrogant, which was a surprise to me because I was actually very often very timid and very afraid because I knew what I was up against.
Right.
So the confidence that people saw was not confidence from myself. And it was not until I decided that I was going to be who I was freely that the battle was no longer important. I've got a lot of scars. I've experienced a lot of trauma, and there have been negative results from that. But I want you to know, as a sister coming behind me,
Yes.
that your new narrative not only affirms and confirms me, but it gives women in ministry something that I did not have. Had someone come along when I was younger in ministry with the narrative that you just described, I would have been able to negotiate much better my experience. So I want to thank God for you. As a woman who's come through the storm in ministry for your new narrative. which is actually not a new narrative. It is a new approach, but it's actually not a new narrative. It's contributed a lot to me as a elder statesman and veteran, so to speak. And I want to say, God bless you. May heaven continue to smile upon you and empower you so that your work can continue, because this is a milestone in ways that you will not ever know.
Thank you.
Dr. Rowe.
Yes, Dr. Robinson, just absolutely enlightening and thoughtful presentation.
God bless you.
And just a couple of questions. Being a pastor here in the city of Rochester, being one of the pastors who don't have a problem with women in ministry, what suggestion, and I do have some colleagues that do,
Right.
and what do you think is a good approach to emphasize the importance of having women in ministry? That's the first question.
Okay, you want me to answer that first?
Yes.
Okay, so historically speaking, especially with my research along the lines of the Methodist Church, and we're talking about 1820, somewhere in that area with the Civil War, civil rights. I don't have all the dates, but women were not allowed to preach per se, but we were allowed to pray, we were allowed to teach scripture, and we were allowed to testify. I would say that using that approach to put a wedge in the door, because preaching right now is a lot like testifying. It's a lot like teaching scripture, because now we have more theological debate. We have more theological influence as far as the way that we present the gospel now. And so I would suggest that one of the wedges, I think that's what you're asking, is how would you approach having women in ministry, is that sometimes you can do something and not call it what they think it is. Does that make sense? Am I saying something?
Yes.
So where someone would say, oh, she's preaching. No, she's not. She's testifying. And so I think that the pushback that you will get sometimes, because it's hard to be accepted in a culture that is so stony. Right? The Bible says, remove the stones and the rocks out of the path that my people are getting ready to travel. So the fact that you've even asked that question means that you're tasked with this assignment. And so what I would suggest that you do, and I'm just going to say it one last time, worship is therapeutic. And women, I believe women of color, and this is just for me, worship in a way that no man can worship the way that we worship. And no one who has not been oppressed in this country can worship the way that we worship. And so using that as the wedge of worship. Now this is a great time to put a plug. If you'd like to know more, I have a book over here.
Thank you so much for that. I'll make sure I get it. Secondly, when you think about the parameters, if you will, or the parameters that some men resist women in ministry, I can think of two categories. One is power,
Right?
and the other is control.
Yes.
I'm sure there's some others.
The Holy Ghost. Main time.
And what do you think is, of those two, power and control? What do you think is the driving force that enabled men not to go in ministry?
Well, the thing about it is, in my lecture when I was reading, I have this book called The History of the African American Church, and it's an anthology, and I would have to look at my notes again to give you the exact citation. However, we have to remember that this is a very long narrative. And so we are now contributing to the narrative. And so what ends up happening in the history of our church, remember at its origin, that's the only thing that makes the black church, is that it belongs to the black people. Now, me as a womanist theologian, I want to see my black men empowered. I want to see them standing in their rightful positions, whatever that may be, whatever God has called them to do. I don't believe that our black men should have a level of infirmity. But what drives people to go through power and control, or drives people to strive for power and control, is actually the lack of it. And that's one thing that I've learned, because see, when you know who you are and you know whose you are, then you don't have to strive for a power that doesn't belong to you. The Bible says that there's a crown of righteousness that is laid up for me. All I have to do is get there. It's mine. So we don't have to compete. So I think that what has happened is, since the black church, when black men were first freed, they wanted to have some level of identity, some level of social location. So the black church became theirs and theirs alone. Not understanding that a lot of the fish fries and the chicken dinners and the missionary work, which kept the lights on, actually came from the women. And so that desire to maintain control over something that they truly have no control over is what creates violence, that spiritual and psychological violence in our church. Is that all right? Okay. Dan Butler.
Yeah.
And then Chad. Okay.
Just an observation,
Yes.
very quickly. I pastor a local Baptist church that for 73 years did not recognize women
Okay.
at all. And I'm crazy. So we immediately had to end that narrative. But at the time, they did not believe in women in ministry whatsoever. The previous pastor preached against it very, very strongly. But one of the questions when I came in, what I was going to do about it, because even the pastoral committee knew that they had to change.
Right.
So it's so new to them. I had to teach for 2 weeks on women in leadership in the church. And the funny thing is, when I would talk to other believers, they would take it for granted. I said, you're not in a position where you see it every day, but try being in a body that you don't see it. So we were able to make some changes. And one of the books I had was Suffer a Woman to Teach. And it breaks it all the way down about the need and the calling on women to present the word of God. It's a man power thing. That's really what it is. It's patriarchy.
Right.
And it's been so infected in us from the westernized mindset of the approach to the text to that it's handicapped us.
Right.
But the thing was, we were able to pull down that narrative where Dr. Robinson was, first my cousin preached. Then I said, I need someone from academia to come in. And she came in, wrecked the house. To where they said, when she coming back? What I'm saying, as a pastor, I had to take the spiritual warfare approach. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And one thing the Lord Jesus said, so true, he said, you make the word of God of none effect because of your tradition.
Right. Right.
Tradition will hinder the move of God.
Yes.
So for me, as a new pastor, we had to pull down old traditional Black Baptist church tradition.
Right.
And we were able to do that. And I think it's important to be open to women flowing in their gift. Because when she came, I said, just go. Because one thing that helps me when I wasn't living in Rochester, I ran with Pentecostals. So you always saw women in leadership, women flowing in the gifts that they've been given. And I think as a pastor, it's important for me to set the tone of the house. And
That's
so,
right.
but you actually encouraged me that I'm on the right road.
Yes.
Because as I see you flow, that helps me to flow better.
Right.
And I think it's important to set that narrative. We've been able to break it. We've been really able to break it. Well, she coming to preach for me on my pastoral anniversary.
Amen. That's a plug.
Amen. Come on. But I just want to say, you really helped me, and I just wanted to share someone else, because there are pastors that still don't like it, but I'm a little different. I'm a little different. So our pulpit is open.
Right.
We've been able to kill that spirit in the house. You got to kill it. You really have to kill it. You really have to kill it. And when we do that, we bless the individuals the Lord has given us to be overseers.
Right.
So I just appreciate you. You're my friend. I'm sure about it tonight. So I just want to encourage you.
Yep, and then Dr. Chad. Let me just say something before Dr. Chad says something. The Lord had told me the letter killeth, but the spirit gives life.
That's right.
And sometimes we allow the letter to kill us. But we need to reintroduce the spirit. Now, one thing I want to make as my disclaimer, we have to be discerning about allowing any type of spirit in our pulpit. Because women do carry a spirit of entitlement. Men carry it too. So we're not looking at the gender or at the vessel, but we have to, what did I say, use your knees. And find out whether, and test the spirit by the spirit, and see if it is of the will of God. Don't just go willy-nilly letting any woman in your pulpit, because if they still middle-aged and haven't gone, can I just say this? They haven't gone through menopause yet, you don't know what you're going to get that week.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robinson, for your lecture today. I'm
Thank you, Dr.
very proud to be here and happy to listen to you and see all your guests. And you have some very interesting followers here and people who are inspired by your work. So, one of the things I want to ask you 2 questions.
Sure.
And before that, I want to throw out there, talking about women being liberated, being given opportunities in the church. One of the things that I've learned as being a convert to the Catholic Church is that women have been not only given plenty of opportunity in the church, but also they've been canonized as saints for over 2,000 years now. So if you look at the ancient practice of Christianity, women have been liberated a long time ago in the Christian church. So it's really nothing new. The first question I want to ask for you is, in your book you talk about womanist theology.
Yes.
I think that one of the fears is what can be perceived as the crossover between womanism and feminism.
Okay.
All right? Because feminism, in its most extreme form, has caused a hatred of men in the West. And several abuses, like what we see in the Planned Parenthood scandal, taken to the extreme.
Right.
So how will you handle criticisms about womanist theology where they fear that there's going to be a